Thank you. Thank you all for coming, too. I know everybody's busy, so it's a real nice thing to have you here. And I'm going to quickly go through just a short number of slides about the project, just to give you a little bit of a background so that when Diane and I start to talk, you'll have the context of the work. You could ask the question, why would a man of my age spend 18 years photographing public libraries around the country? And it's a legitimate question. I get it asked all the time, but it has a lot to do with my interest in the things that we share, the commons. I came out of a background of photography inspired by a guy named Ansel Adams, who I got to know as a young photographer, and he had an amazing policy of, if you wanted to show him your work, you came to his house on Friday night, had a cocktail with him, he'd look at your work. So I lived nearby, and I was all over that. I was there all the time. And he said at one point to me that he was as proud of his work with the environment as he was of his photography. And for a 20-year-old, that was, heady stuff, and that really got me going. It got me starting to think about what I could do with my own photography, how I could maybe use it for social change, or at least my interest in the environment. So I spent many years working on various environmental projects and photography, and eventually came to the point of realizing the shared common of the environment was also something that we share with other things, such as this national infrastructure, public roads, public schools, public libraries, the public commons. And that really was why I focused on this 18 years ago, was really looking at that. And it really now, it seems to be even more timely than ever as we look at the 99% and the 1% and the economic disparity in our culture. What do we in the 99% have? Well, one thing we do have is this vast infrastructure. This goes back over 100 years, the progressive period. People were working to try to bring public education to our culture, and that partly was the impetus for the beginning of the public library system. So for me, in a way, this is a very political project. It's really a project, not just a kind of study of libraries and their architecture, but the essential nature of this idea of the commons and the shared infrastructure. So I'm going to go ahead and show you some slides, and we'll go through this quickly and tell you some of the stories. And yeah, thanks. And the book itself, published by Princeton, very lucky to have people like Bill Moyers and Ann Patchett write for the book. And they all were easy to get to write for the book because they realized, many of them, the library was the thing that allowed them to become the writer, the person that they are. Bill Moyers talked about growing up in poverty in Texas, and that the library kind of saved him. And that was a similar theme that I saw throughout a lot of these writers and their interest in libraries. Let's see if I can push this. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit, and I'm going to make this quick. So libraries, the thing that I found interesting in doing this project is I'm looking at locally financed, tax-supported libraries, individual communities. They're very individual to the communities they come from. And I'm looking at that as on a national scale. So that's what I think is maybe a little bit unique about this project, is trying to understand the individual libraries. So for instance, this library, it was a library built by ex-slaves and is now in San Joaquin County, or San Joaquin Valley in California. It's a library that was built by, led by a man named Colonel Allensworth, who was born into slavery. During the Civil War, he was sold downstream to New Orleans. Union troops freed him. He later became a colonel in the U.S. Army and later migrated to California to start this utopian colony. But it's interesting to watch, as you look at this image, above the door it says Tulare County Free Library, which I think is a very interesting thing when you think about people that came out of slavery, what that word must have meant for them, and building this library on the frontier. Of course, public libraries all have to start somewhere. The first tax-supported public library was built here in Peterborough, New Hampshire in 1833. So here's my wife, Ellen, who's in the audience on her BlackBerry in front of the library. And for me, this was like going to Mecca. This was the beginning of it all. The idea of a tax-supported public library has since become a worldwide idea. But it started here, and like a lot of good ideas came out of New England. This is another New England library. Early on in doing the project, I was fascinated by the ideas. Well, what is a library? It could be more than books. It can include art. And this is up at St. Johnsbury, Vermont, and that's a Bierstadt painting of Yosemite in the background, and Ellen looking on at the painting, and it was filled with painting and artwork, a very interesting place. This is another interesting library right on the border with Canada and Vermont. So this is a library that's on Derby Line, and the U.S. border goes right through the middle of the library, and my son Walker is photographing the monument. The library doubles as an opera house, so you can go into the library and check your books in Vermont, and you can exit out in Quebec, in Canada. It's some early 20th century example of international cooperation. It seems very quaint nowadays with our, sealed borders. The Millicent Library, a beautiful library that Mark Twain actually thought all libraries should be this beautiful. And he even wrote the library this beautiful letter, which I included in the book, showing his respect for this place. And these older northeastern libraries, of course, you're all very lucky to have a library that is one of the great libraries in the world. And I know it's gone through some problems recently, but it's still one of the great research centers of the world and one of the great libraries of all time. I did travel around and photographed other classic libraries, such as this one in Evansville, Indiana. This is the only library, they say, that is haunted. So, and they do have a ghost cam that you can watch that, stares at the wall for, infinite amount of time. But apparently there are many sightings of the Gray Lady, including, I think I saw her. I was in a remote part of the library, and I saw something, I wasn't sure, but it could have been her. So we'll see. Los Angeles, the main library, I don't know if any of you have been to the LA main library, but a beautiful place. And I was given 1 hour before the library opened, and I work with a large format view camera under a dark cloth, so I had to run around the library and try to find the right spot. And fortunately, I found this spot in front of the children's library in this mural. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Some of the libraries are truly monumental. This took up a whole block of the city of Milwaukee. It's just this incredible, almost German-looking structure, but it says something about how people think about libraries. Yazoo City, Mississippi, another absolutely brilliant place. We walked into the library. The librarian was thrilled that we were there, and he proceeded to show us all of the archives and tell us the story of the place. That's one thing that I found interesting. Libraries are really repositories of community stories. So he told us all the good, the bad, and the ugly of Yazoo City, and he even introduced us to the witch of Yazoo City, which I didn't have a chance to talk to her, but my son went out to lunch with her, and that's a whole other story we don't have time to talk about, but it's quite a fascinating place. And this is another essential library for me. This is in Braddock, Pennsylvania. This is the first Carnegie Library that was built, and it was at the beginning of a system that Carnegie built over many years that doubled the number of libraries in the United States. So he took about 70% of his vast wealth and put it into this project of building public libraries throughout the United States. So this was the first, and it was interesting to go to this place because inside it had a swimming pool, it had a basketball court, it had a track, and it had lots of books. And it was just amazing to think of his ideas. He built this really essentially for his workers. And later, some of the workers said, well, it would have been nice if he had paid us a living wage instead of building these libraries after he was wealthy. But while I was standing out in front of this library, I was about to take this picture, and I was under my dark cloth when a hand reached in and tried to grab my tripod, so I pushed it away, and I came out from under the dark cloth, and this guy punched me right in the jaw really hard, and I was just like shocked. He thought I had taken his picture. He was 2 blocks off to the left of the library building, and my camera was pointed that way, so he was obviously out of his mind. But I was much more street savvy after that. I looked around a lot. Here I am right after the event. My son Walker took this picture, and it shows the camera. I'm reaching in to make sure I still have my cell phone and keys. On the other end of the spectrum of these large, beautiful libraries are the new libraries. And of course, has anybody been to this one? The Seattle Public Library is absolutely stunning, built by Dutch architect Rem Koolhaas, and one of the great modern libraries of all time. And I had, again, an hour before the library opened, I was escorted around by a friend of mine who was a librarian there. And she explained to me that it's a beautiful place, but it doesn't really function very well as a library, because at night when they have to kick everybody out, there's all these nooks and crannies. So it's really a work of art, but it's not a great functional library. On the other hand, the Salt Lake City Library is both a work of art and a very functional place. And Chip Ward, who has an essay in the book, wrote about how they used community feedback to really design and build and make the library. And it is a very vital, functioning place that is fantastic. And it also helps to have the snow-capped Wasatch Mountains right in the backyard there, so you can look at that from the library, the view of the images. Duluth, Minnesota, looks like an alien spaceship has landed. And of course, Las Vegas, Nevada, you would expect that they had an over-the-top library, which they do, along with the Children's Museum that you can see here. Those are some of the classic big city libraries, but frankly, the ones almost more interesting to me were the small town libraries, the places that in some ways they're the only act in town. There's not much else going on in some of these communities, and the library was it. It's one of the few nonprofit, non-religious spaces that we have left. So it's an interesting thing to think about it in those terms. And so this is a gathering place for the community. This library was built in Roscoe, South Dakota by a group of civic-minded women called the Priscilla Embroidery Club in the early 20th century. And they wanted to have a library. So they literally built the library. They got their husbands to haul the rock and the lumber, and they put it together, and then they staffed the library for decades until they all got too old, at which point they had just closed the library when I took this picture. But it talks about the importance, why these small towns especially place importance on it. Here's another example, Mendota, California. These kids were looking at me wondering what the heck I was doing, but they're very happy I was there because I was the only thing going on at that point. 2011, 2012, I spent both summers traveling all over the United States finishing this project. And I was fortunate to have my 21-year-old son, Walker, join me, and we traveled 10,000 miles the first summer and 11,000 miles the second summer. So we covered a lot of ground. And we were both interested in the demographics of the United States and different ways you can think about how we are as a nation. So we went to some of the wealthiest communities in the United States, the poorest, some of the most liberal, most conservative, most Hispanic, most African American, and so on. We would look at those different categories and find out, well, what does a public library look like? So here is a library in Abilene, Texas. Now I was interested because Abilene is the most politically conservative place in the United States. And, if they hate the government, what does their public library look like? So I really wanted to go there, and no surprise, they love their public library as much as people in liberal San Francisco do, and which is where I'm from. And it was kind of fascinating because, it's something, maybe public libraries can be a form of connection, even in our divisive country where we have a lot of things that separate us. There are a few things that we can agree upon. Public libraries are a good thing. And I found that even in places like Abilene. Midland, Texas, home of George Bush and Laura Bush, famous oil town. And, a lot of times when I'm driving on these road trips, I'm on the road for 2, 3, 4 weeks at a time, and I'm, by the end of, all day of driving, I don't look so good. And, my t-shirt's sweaty, my shorts crumpled, and eyes are bloodshot. So I walked into this library, and I said to the librarian, "Hi, I'm Bob Dawson, and I'd like to photograph your library." And she looked at me up and down, and I could tell it's going to be not so good. And she was kind of a little standoffish until I mentioned I was from San Francisco. And then for some reason, she just opened up, and it was great. And all of a sudden, she opened up the Petroleum Archive Room and the George Bush collection. And I was like a kid in the candy store. It was really, it was quite amazing, the reaction to us as we drove around. Round Valley, Valley, Nevada. This is a valley that's the size of the state of Rhode Island, and it's a company town. So it's an gold mining, and you can see off in the distance on the right the mine tailings. And this was the library that they had in this small place. The Northeastern Nevada Bookmobile travels 40,000 miles a year in one of the most remote parts of the 48 states. And we got the guy that drives this thing, Kelvin Selders, to write an essay for the book. It was wonderful. And this guy, grown up in poverty, not a lot of education, but he drives a bookmobile. And he said, you know what it's like to drive a bookmobile into a community and have kids running up to your truck, and to see their delight and how excited they are about that you've arrived and that you're there. And it's a great essay. It's really something you might want to consider and look at. And also I was interested in libraries as places of art and memory. So here is Moose Pass, Alaska. I was out in 1994 driving around and saw this mural on the side of the library. And while I was there, a professional photographer drove by and took my photograph while I was working. And then he later sent me a little color slide. Remember those things? You used to, yeah. So that's what this was from back in the early days. But other examples of art and public library. And this is near Zion National Park in southern Utah, just a spectacular place. This was a library in Austin, Texas. The African-American community there had lobbied for years to get a library. And finally, when they did, they put this up, and they had this mural, which is about the African slave trade and slavery in the United States. And again, the art often in libraries reflects the local stories, what the community values. That's one reason why I was doing these images. Here's in Long Beach, California, which is a large city in the southern part of California. I set up my view camera, and I was looking around, and there was a homeless gentleman that kind of locked eyes with me, and he walked right up to me. And he got about 6 inches from my face, and he said, "I'm ready for my close-up, Mr. DeMille." And then he turned around and he walked away, and I was just flabbergasted. But it was just amazing. And there are these New Deal murals that they rescued from the old library that you see in this image. And here are all the Miss Cass Lake Beauty Contest winners in Cass Lake, Minnesota. And so this is about 50% Native American, 50% white. So the beauty queens are all kind of reflect that demographic. San Antonio, Texas, a Chihuly sculpture. Lowell, Massachusetts. It's very interesting to see, again, when I come back east, I'm fascinated by people, the historical component of back in the east, and this was one example of a Civil War mural, and the idea of putting this in the library. In California, we don't think much about the Civil War, but obviously it's something that's a bigger deal back here. So Lowell also represents what I call literary libraries, because libraries oftentimes writers would be associated with. So Jack Kerouac apparently as a young boy played a lot of hooky from school, and he went to the library, so they could always catch him in the stacks. And then later in his life, when he came back to Lowell and he was an alcoholic, he would often be passed out in the stacks as well. So this library has a lot of association with him. And I'm interested in libraries in national parks. So Yosemite National Park has a beautiful library in the Girls Club, which is this building here. And it just happened to be that all the leaves on the trees fell right before I took this photo, so it's very nicely covered. And then, of course, Death Valley National Park, which is literally the hottest place on Earth. The highest temperature in the history of the world is in Death Valley, and thank God they have that air conditioner there, but I sure hope it doesn't break. Kind of interesting. And then abandoned libraries, Sunflower, Mississippi, the Mississippi Delta. Not a lot going on in Mississippi Delta and in Sunflower. And it's so sad to see a library that's closed, because that means that whole community then is cut off from the possibilities of what a library could be. Another abandoned library in an abandoned town in Jeffrey City, Wyoming. This used to be a uranium mining town. Now it's it's nothing. Nobody there. And then Detroit. I spent several days photographing the main library and then all the branch libraries in Detroit. And it's very sad to see what's happened there. In this one, in this case was abandoned and later torn down. In other libraries, we happened to be there on the hottest day in the history of Detroit. So, it was pretty brutal. And when we went into the library, it was very interesting to see the library was packed. And they were there because there's a guard at the door with a gun on his hip, and they had AC. So, yeah, it makes sense, that the library would be packed. But libraries now, according to the American Library Association, are more used than ever in the history of libraries. And also books are more checked out now more than ever in the past. So it is an interesting thing to see that. It's also interesting to see the transformation of some libraries. So this used to be the Americana nightclub in Austin, Texas, some kind of swinging hotspot. And now, of course, it's the Ralph Yarborough Public Library. So the evolution of libraries and changes of libraries. This was a Union Pacific Railway station in Caliente, Nevada, way out in the remote part of southern Nevada. Weeping Waters, Nebraska. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. This obviously used to be a church, and now it's a public library. And the public library in Kansas City, Missouri is in what used to be a very large bank. And this is where they show movies. The vault downstairs, and they have a movie theater and the seats and the screen. It's quite remarkable. And also the multi-use of some libraries. This is Tuscarora, Nevada, very remote kind of ghost town, way out in the middle of nowhere. And this woman is both runs the post office and the library in the same building. And community uses of libraries too. I'm very interested in San Francisco. A lot of the young companies, young entrepreneurs starting businesses will come and meet in the libraries because the library rooms are free. They can just use those as a starting place for their own businesses. Also, libraries are about literacy, and it's something that you and I kind of take for granted that we can all read. But in some cases, there's quite a few people that limp along that aren't able to read. So this is a reading lesson taken early on in San Francisco. And this is the main library in Chicago, showing one of the changes over the 18 years of doing the project is computers have become essential to functioning our society. So if you don't have access to a computer or the internet, you go to the public library. If you don't know how to use a computer, well, one place you can learn is at the public library. So these are all kind of the roles that I'm beginning to discover in doing the project that are essential, kind of not just nice, but very important in terms of our society. Here's our son Walker sitting in front of the Justin Morrill Library in Stratford, Vermont, near where we have a cabin in the woods. And Justin Morrill grew up poor in the 19th century. Later, when he became a U.S. Senator, he started the series of land-grant colleges all over the United States. And it's kind of interesting in small little communities all over the country. The libraries at night turn on their Wi-Fi. They leave the Wi-Fi on. And then people come sometimes from miles around, and they bring their laptops, and they sit down and they get access to the information of the internet. And this was something that I think Justin Morrill would be very proud of, that his little library was doing this, was continuing that idea. And this library in West Wendover, Nevada, I came to photograph the inside. There was a sign on the door that said it was a class. So I set up my view camera outside. And when the class came running out, and it was all these little kids with rifles, and they're all lined up there on the left in a row, and they're facing the casinos off in the distance and the desert mountains. And you can't make this stuff up. I had to take the picture, of course, after that happened. The Berkeley Tool Lending Library. So looking at how libraries have changed, they're doing many things besides checking out books, obviously. These guys were so busy. It was unbelievable. There were so many people coming in, checking out, saws and, hammers and weed whackers or whatever you want. I had to beg them to stand still for 1 second while I took this photograph, and then they were off checking out other equipment. It was quite interesting. And then, of course, places of tragedy. We have libraries as forms of refugee. This is the New Orleans Public Library, which was devastated by the Hurricane Katrina, and this was a couple of years afterwards. One of the last pictures I took in the project was after Hurricane Sandy. We came out to New York to visit our son, and and we went there 2 weeks after Sandy, and just happened to be the library in the background had all of the books taken out and put into the dumpster you see on the left. It just had happened. And so the library was obviously closed, destroyed, but they did have a bookmobile that was brought in, which gave people a chance to, recharge their cell phones, get on the internet and just get warm. I mean, it was cold at that time of year, and it was an amazing example, again, of what libraries can be. And then just to show you, I'm getting near the end, a few images of the process of working on this. This is the camera that I worked with. I started in 1994 with a large format view camera, so film-based photography. So I continued that throughout the entire 18 years. And just for the consistency. When you work with that kind of camera, you have to change film every night. So you have to have a dark room. So of course, every motel we stayed in had a bathroom, which I would go into, and you can see me here with the film, sheet film, and then the boxes to put it in, and of course the music, you have to be able, and then the good beer, often that was all essential, it was all part of the process. And I would do this every night. It was just kind of a ritual I got into. And we also kept a blog, which I put up on WordPress.com, and we also did a Kickstarter campaign to finance one of the summers. And I'm a big supporter of crowdsourcing funding now at this point, because I think it works. It worked for us at least, and it's a lot of little amounts of contributions that add up into whatever you want. And so the book was published in April. At the same time, my wife Ellen and I got a very nice grant from a Creative Work Fund Foundation in the Bay Area, and I also got a Guggenheim Fellowship. So with the money from those grants, Ellen and I are going to spend the next year working in a city called Stockton, California. Anybody know or heard of Stockton? It's the second largest city in the United States to declare bankruptcy, and it's one of the least literate cities in the country. So we're trying to work with groups that are supporting libraries and literacy in this very, very dysfunctional place. And how do you photograph literacy? How do you make images that deal with that? So I'll let you know in about a year when I'm done. I'm in the process of figuring it out now. But one thing that I came up with was, what are the reasons why you have to read? What's essential about that? So for instance, this came out of a story of a young woman who had breast cancer. She was given medicine, but she couldn't read the labels, and it got worse. And this is one of the things that I'm starting to try to now show examples of reasons why we have to know how to read to function and survive even in our society. Or the idea of reading. There's a ophthalmologist that said, 60% of kids that can't read can't see. And it's, they just either don't have the money to buy glasses, or they don't want to go into get a medical exam because they can't read the letters, and they're embarrassed about that. So for me, I'm trying to get into the mind of what it must be like to not be literate and to make images that represent that. And I'm also showing examples of, here is a program at the Stockton Public Library called Book Buddies. So there are all these teenagers that are acting as volunteer tutors 3 times a week for 1 hour with these kids that come in and need help. And it's an intense, amazing process to watch this happen, because these kids are really earnest. They're really needy of getting this kind of information. Their parents are sitting in the background, and they wait for an hour, and it was phenomenal to watch. The man on the left is an astronaut named Jose Hernandez, a retired astronaut. He grew up right next to a low-income housing project called Sierra Vista. And these are the kids in Sierra Vista in this very, very poor part of Stockton. And he's showing a film of himself as an astronaut floating around in space, and the kids' eyes are bugging out, and they're just like, wow, this is great. And then at the end he says, well, if you want to become an astronaut, you can do it, but you have to stay in school, you have to learn how to read, and you have to know how to do math. And it's kind of a good message. I think it's interesting to watch people like him that are doing these things. These are the tutors that some of them live in the low-income housing project. I got to know them a little bit and what they're doing. This is one of the tutors. She didn't have money for babysitting, so she brought her infant child in. But she's very committed to the idea of being a tutor. And finally, this guy, Michael Tubbs, he was 16 when he was born. His mother was 16 when he was born. His father has been in prison his whole life, and he went to Stanford, spent 4 years getting his undergraduate and graduate degree. While he was at Stanford, he met this woman named Oprah. She's only funded 2 political campaigns, Barack Obama and Cory Booker, and then she funded his political campaign. While he was a senior at Stanford, he got on the city council of Stockton. So the guy is now on the city council. He's 23 years old. And he has a book club that he started for these low-income kids, that he's doing these amazing things, incredible stories. And one of the things the kids in the Sierra Vista low-income housing, when Michael Tubbs came to visit, was to write him a letter. And almost all of them at the end would write about, we need help with the shooting problem. So this is an area that has extreme violence. It's one of the most violent cities today in the United States. There was just a story a couple weeks ago out of Stockton of some hostage situation. Some people got killed. It's terrible. And these kids see this all the time. So learning is a way out. I think literacy is a way of getting beyond the circumstances sometimes that we find ourselves in, and so that's kind of the motivation for me. The Stockton project came out of the larger library project, but this is what I do. So I think we're going to end it here, and we're going to have some time now for Diane to ask me some penetrating questions, and we'll take it from there.
So I thought I'd start by asking you, what were the libraries like where you grew up, and what was your experience of them?
It's so interesting. Everybody that I've talked to about this project immediately takes it back to their own library. And I get an awful lot of people that are really pissed off at me for not photographing their library. There are 17,000 public libraries in the United States, so I couldn't do them all. But I grew up in a working class town, West Sacramento, California. Mom was a school teacher. My dad worked for a trucking company. And the library was pretty important. It was one of those things like Bill Moyers was talking about, where it was an escape. It was something else. It wasn't West Sacramento, and that way I was very thankful for that. So getting out of West Sacramento when I was a kid, I did it partly through going to the library, and that kind of, I could understand this reaction of these other people, why they value the library so much.
Well, I can tell you, actually, I'm not one of those people, since I grew up in New York. So you got the public, the reading room at the public library, where as a kid, if I went to do a research project, I felt like a real researcher. I was doing something real. And you got my Rockaway library. That mobile truck was right around the corner from my house. So it's very, so what a library means, it's a lot of different things.
And you said earlier that there's now a trailer.
Well, that's the thing in the book. If you look, there's on the other side of the spread, it's the trailer from Katrina that's supposed to be the temporary library, but it's like 3 years later. And we now still have, instead of that mobile truck, we have a trailer that's still there. But I will say, I use that trailer if I need to print something, if I don't have my laptop and I need to check something. So it's, it definitely functions that way.
And I think one thing artists can sometimes do is to point to things that we take for granted or we don't think about. And I think that's eventually, for me, I realized the library system took on layers and layers of meaning. And, just there was so much there. I'm not a librarian. I don't have training or background in libraries, but I'm part of the public. And as a person of, that supports public institutions and public libraries, I think we have to be the ones that speak up if we want to save these things, because they are going fast, and you all know this. I mean, the funding is terrible in many situations for all kinds of publicly supported institutions, not just libraries. But that was one of the motivations for me of doing the project.
So when did you first start it? And how did it start? Did you set out to do a big project on libraries, or did it kind of evolve out of something else you were doing?
It actually, for many years, was a back burner project as I was doing other book projects and other things. It started in 1994. My wife Ellen and I and another photographer, Brian Grogan, were talking about these ideas, and it sort of came out of a conversation. And there was also a book some of you may know, called Courthouse, that was done in the 1970s, and it was a very interesting study of many photographers were commissioned to photograph public courthouses all over the U.S. And so it was an interesting example of maybe architecture and photography and this kind of public infrastructure, and I began to kind of connect with it more because of that. And those all pieces kind of gradually fell together. But the project began by my photographing all 24 branch libraries in San Francisco in 1994. And then after that, I knew I had a lot more work to do. So,
so one of the things that I think is very striking about the book is the range, both in terms of the kinds of libraries, from the roving truck in the desert to these grand spaces, but you've also chosen to represent them in different ways. Sometimes you're across the street, sometimes it's a little detail. How did you think about those decisions? Because obviously you must have been starting from, I imagine, a huge trove of images to choose from.
Yeah. Well, the selection process was pretty daunting. I did have to go edit more images out of the project than wound up in the end in the book. But looking at libraries when we were doing the research, my son explained to me how to use Google Street View. So we were actually able to visit every library before we went to it, and to make decisions partly based on what the library looked like. And even the time of day, you could tell, oh yeah, this would be much better to photograph in the morning. This would be better in the afternoon. You could see that through that decision. But a lot of the decisions about which libraries to photograph came out of historical importance, the stories that are associated with the libraries, as well as the physical structure itself. By the way, there are many people apparently going out there that photograph libraries. I didn't realize this, but there's this cult of people that spend a lot of time traveling around photographing libraries, and some of them make beautiful books. You probably have several of them here that are just gorgeous. I don't do that. I mean, I wish I could, but my pictures tend to be more plain. But they're really more about kind of the use of the library and its relevancy to the community and to this idea of the commons. So those are the things that ultimately drew me in. If the library had those things in it, that's why I would go and photograph.
Okay. So we talked about this a little bit this morning, and I'm conscious that I'm going to ask this question in the rare book room of the Strand, sort of surrounded by beautiful old books. But we live in a world where things are increasingly digitized, right? Google is digitizing books. Supposedly, if you have an iPhone, or you can have access to anything. So, what's the importance of preserving the physical spaces and also these physical objects?
Yeah, and I would throw in that also physical librarians, because the librarians are very different than going on the web. They can help you, and they can explain things to you, and they can give you references, and they can point you in directions which you wouldn't have. And also also in a bookstore, there's serendipity of being able to come across something that you didn't expect is a little bit different than doing web research. I think also libraries are beginning to understand that they're having to take on other roles. And we talked, and I showed some of them, but in some ways they're less about books and they're more about community. They're representing community in a way that I think you go to a lot of small towns now and you see the libraries, and it's a place people really identify with. All of you probably have your own individual library, and you're, again, as I said, pissed off that I didn't photograph it, but there's this strong identity with that, which I think is kind of curious, and it's very different than the internet. We don't, feel that same way about our computers. So it has something to do with who we are, and I think the fact that we associate with that. And the libraries oftentimes are also places, as I mentioned before, of civic memory. Towns often will put their archives and their recollections and their old collections and old photographs and various things, as well as the books, in the library, and that then becomes sort of a place of pride. In some ways, libraries are lucky because they do have, many of us have fond memories of going to the libraries as kids. So librarians have said they'll pass bond issues to help fund the library more than they will, say, other forms of government. In some cases, in some communities, the library is the only form of government that people like. So there's a lot of reasons why the place itself, the essential space, and the idea of the architecture then can sometimes be very distinctive, very inspiring, or very plain and very utilitarian. In some ways, my project represented a look at America in the 18 years that I did this project, because so much of what these libraries represent are what America is at this time, and I was hoping to do that. So it's a bigger portrait than just the libraries, but who we are as a people and what do we value at this point in time. It's interesting to see other writers or people that are trying to do that same thing, because I think right now we live in such divisive time. It's nice to find those things that are common ideas. Dan Hoyle, who's sitting here in the front row, has been doing this through his own way of performance and interpretation of journalism, and using kind of coming from a similar place. I mean, we have some similar interests, I think, in terms of trying to define America and the American people and the American experience, and those are things partly that motivated me to do this.
So what sort of lessons did you learn out there? What do you think? Who do you think we are right now through the library?
A good question. And the big shocking takeaway that I had is I think we have more in common as a people than what separates us. And this, I am as cynical as anybody in this room. I wouldn't have expected that I would say that at the end of 18 years. But most people, they work hard. They love their families, maybe. They love their communities. They love their local library many times. We have a lot that really we share. Most people are very decent. And except for the guy that punched me in the jaw, I wasn't affected too many times. I had a lot of people that looked at me strange. But that was one of the surprising things, was that we have much in common. The other thing, which I didn't know as much as I know now, is that it's a very delicate system which can go away. We don't necessarily, there's no guarantee that we can keep this infrastructure, the structure that we kind of take for granted and depend on. It's a very tenuous type of thing, and that's when you start seeing libraries closing or cut back. Those can have consequences for communities. They have no other resources, and that's something that I again did the project based on wanting to change that, or make people aware that this is something that's important.
So were there places out there where you felt like maybe towns or cities that were meeting the challenge of keeping these libraries open in creative ways that others might follow, or no? Yeah,
I'd say, I mentioned before, libraries tend to be a place that it's irrational, but if people are going to support any form of their government, it probably would be the library. And it's probably for all those reasons I mentioned before, because it's so much of the identity of the community. So people almost, that's maybe one of the last things they would want to cut back on.
Although it's always the first thing that gets cut, right?
Because do you cut the police department and the fire department, or do you cut the library?
And some would argue that's a false choice.
Of course it is.
But that's usually what happens. You watch in New York City budget, it's always the first things that go are libraries and parks. No, I think and also it's interesting to see, there's a whole section in the book which I didn't mention that deals with alternatives to libraries, sort of unusual examples of ways people would put libraries together. So there's things like a seed lending library. There have been even a story in the paper, I guess, today about this, but the idea that people can, these different seed lending libraries, check out seeds, take them home, plant them, and they teach you how to harvest the seeds, and then you bring them back once you have those. There's a story of a one-woman town in Manawi, Nebraska, that this woman lived in an area of the country which is rapidly depopulating in the Midwest.
partly due to drought, lack of economic opportunity. So most everybody had moved out of the town. When this woman's husband died, she was the last person in town. So she's the only person in town. She paid taxes to herself to keep the lights on, and she runs a bar that's on the edge of town. And her husband, Rudy, had a big book collection. So she put up a shed next to the bar, and you can go into Rudy's library and you can check out a book and just sign your name and send it back in when you're done. It's just phenomenal. It was about 180 degrees inside the library when I photographed that day, but I was just fascinated. I spent hours in there dripping with sweat, but stories going back to the Depression and World War II, and it's just it's incredible to see that and to kind of learn that, here's an example. It's a memorial to her husband, but it's also this idea that the books were important to this guy, and that she wanted to make those available to other people. It's just phenomenal.
That's cool. That's cool. So I want to make sure that we get some questions from the audience. I'll just ask you one last thing. So I met Bob about 6 years ago when I was taking a digital photography class at Stanford as part of a fellowship. So I just want to geek out a little bit. You got to this a little bit towards the end, kind of going through the process and the camera that you use. I wondered, one, if you had any second thoughts about the view camera given your, sort of bad encounter. But if you could talk a little bit about why you stick with that means and, film and how digital might have changed. Not just the look of the book, but also your interactions with people as you photographed.
Boy, you learned a lot when you were going to Stanford. This is great. These are good questions about photography. It does change. I think any camera that you use will cause you to take different kinds of photographs. And I know that with a large camera on a tripod, you're kind of stuck. You're not going to be doing fast action photojournalism, street photography very well. Or if you do, it'll be a different kind of street photography than Gary Winogrand did or Robert Frank. It's just, not going to be the same thing. So for me, the large format, one thing it does very well is it shows detail. Large negatives give you incredible amount of detail. And it's also perfect for architecture because you can adjust the camera for perspective control. So there were a lot of reasons why, above and beyond the decision to be film or digital, that camera was the right one for this. I also did some work with a medium format camera as well when I didn't feel comfortable setting up my view camera. And there was one situation in a library in Philadelphia where I think my medium format camera broke, and so I had to set up my large format view camera. It was an extremely, I didn't know it at the time, but extremely dangerous neighborhood. So when I set up my view camera, guys on one end of the street started swarming around. Guys on the other end of the street started swarming around. Ellen was there with me and our son Walker, and I took the picture and threw it in the back of the camera, and we got out of there. But I wished I had my more portable camera. And the look too is part of it. But I think it's more the aesthetics of the camera and how it causes you to take certain kinds of images.
Okay. Great. So do we have questions? Do you want to moderate? Or
Does anybody from the audience have a question today?
Yes.
I'm going to give you the mic.
One quick thing before my question. I actually happened to be in Far Walkerway, and I saw you taking that picture.
What?
I was a Hurricane Sandy responder, and I happened to be in Rockaway, and a bunch of us saw you, and we didn't know what you were up to.
Yeah.
And then I said, oh, I think that's the guy from the Kickstarter project, and so that's why the cops left you alone. So you're good. No.
That's amazing story.
No, because a few of us, like police, fire department, responders from different a few of us saw you right outside the library, and we had no idea. And then when you took your hood off and I saw your face, I was like, oh, that's the guy from the Kickstarter project about libraries. And then everyone was like, well, you're the resident nerd, so we trust you that you know who he is. But my question is, the woman in Nebraska that has that library that's kind enough to lend to the public, I assume based upon what your story is saying, she operates it on trust that you are going to give her the book back. But considering she is in such a remote area, how far do people go to visit her library?
It's interesting because I looked at the book, And in the book where you checked it out, you put your name, I think maybe an address, and where you were from. And there was from all over the world. And partly it was because there were articles that had been written about her and about that library, Rudy's Library that it was called. And so it was quite fascinating. I mean, a lot of it was local people, but a lot of people were coming from everywhere because this was such an incredible thing to see in this remote part of central Nebraska. So, wow, I'm just flabbergasted that you saw me there.
Anyone who didn't have proper press credentials were getting kicked out of the meeting.
Oh.
But because I happened to know who you were, I told the authorities to let you leave you alone.
That's even better.
That's awesome.
Cops going around, and they drove around several times. I was sitting in the car and writing emails or something, and
I just told everyone because I was also 9/11 responders, so they trusted me. And I told them, oh, don't worry, the guy's cool.
Well, there were many people in the 18 years that I did the project that wondered what the heck I was doing. And so now it's good to hear the stories about people that actually were, you knew. Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Oh, I'm glad you recognized.
No, but you said that earlier, yeah.
Any other questions out there this evening? And one thing that I was kind of curious about when you were talking about the particular library we could enter in the United States and then exit in Canada had me kind of thinking about how this project might have started getting the gears going on how libraries work internationally. Have you done any projects on other continents?
Yeah, actually, that could be my next project. So that hopefully, because there are such compelling stories about libraries all over the world, and it really would be something, if I have the time and the money, I would definitely want to do that as a next project. We've done some work already. There's a couple. There's one I definitely would want to go see in Medellin, Colombia, which is a city you may know was racked by the war, the drug wars, and a horrible place in terms of poverty and whatever. But since that violence is cut back, they've started to build these incredible libraries in the favelas, up on the hills where the poor people live, and use those libraries as part of the healing process for the community. And my God, I just think that would be so interesting to go and to see that and to photograph that and see what how they're doing that and what that's about. Sarajevo, another incredible story, the town that was bombarded and shelled for years, and the library in Sarajevo was targeted because they wanted to erase the memory of the people living in Sarajevo, and it was so they blew it up, and now they've rebuilt it, and they actually just opened it recently. It's an incredible story. So things like that to me are very vital, very important, and they say something about why this is an important thing to know about. So, yeah.
I actually have two questions. The first is whether your camera style, using the tripod and the large camera, if that style is influenced by your relationship with Ansel Adams?
Well, it's a good question, because you are influenced by your teachers and the people who you copy from, and Walker Evans was another person who was a very influential person, Dorothea Lange. They were all people that I was inspired by early on. So yeah, I think it is. And so much of the work that I've done has come from working in landscape in the American West. I've worked on water issues dealing with agriculture, always used a large format camera. So it's a camera I'm comfortable with. I feel and fortunately, it's also a great camera to take those large 4x5-inch negatives and scan them. So then you can have that incredible amount of information, and that then can be done as a digital output if you want, or you can make prints from that, either way. So in a way, it's almost the best of both worlds, the large format camera and then doing the scanning and digital output, which is one of the things I do a fair amount now with working. So.
That's awesome. The second question is whether or not you see your project is also responding to the issue with ebooks. You're photographing libraries as a sort of cultural, monumental, artistic work. but yet not only do they speak to culture as a physical monument and phenomenon, but also to ebooks and people. You mentioned that people are using the libraries more, but then at the same time people are ordering more ebooks. Do you enter that conversation sometimes? And what is your stance?
Yeah, good question. I do think that ebooks are going to be increasingly a form of a way of getting information. I don't think it necessarily has to supplant and take away from this other form of information, ways of gathering stories. I think if anything, it'll just be an addition to, and I hope so. I mean, I hope we can be as flexible in a culture to be able to accommodate both. But I don't think that it necessarily has to replace it. I think the physical object of a book, especially speaking here in the rare book room, seems obvious that we have these things that we value for lots of reasons. I prefer to read a book rather than an ebook, although I wouldn't be opposed to reading an ebook. I just feel that there's an appropriate place for all of these things. It depends on the situation too, but I find that we're, as a culture, we're at a place now where I think in some ways people are beginning to rediscover the value of a book. That we're just, even though ebooks are getting more popular and it's becoming a whole new phenomenon, people are also maybe not wanting to lose that. It's a little bit like photography and not giving up film. It's interesting, when I teach photography at Stanford, all the beginning classes are taught with film cameras. And, once students get into the darkroom, you can't get them out of the darkroom. It's like this incredible thing about being, that physicality of that process. So I think it's maybe a little early for us to say that the books are dead and they will not be around.
We are just out of time for the evening, so on behalf of the Strand, we want to thank Robert and Diane for joining us this evening. You're going to get Robert set up at the table just behind us to sign some books, and most of all, thank you all for coming out tonight. Take care.